a super brief introduction to who I am. So I'm Rhiannon. I'm a final year medical student, and I'm a climate and health justice campaigner. So kind of what that means is that I primarily came to this work through working on health inequalities and health justice, and then through that came to environmental justice and climate justice. And yeah, so that's kind of the route to which I came to this work, mostly through as a result of kind of feeling that I was being trained as a doctor and not really being trained to tackle any of the things which are killing people or making people unwell. So that's how I kind of came to this work. And what I'm going to be sharing today is very much like collective knowledge from the people who I work with in movements, in academia, in community. And it's very much not like I came up with these ideas by myself or any of this really. It's all like collective knowledge. And I'm also definitely not the only kind of like person with knowledge in this room. So it'd be really great, especially because it's a small group, to think about how we can share our collective knowledge. And something that I'm going to be talking potentially a little bit more about later is the gatekeeping of the topic of health and how intimidating it can be, because it's kind of seen as this area of like expertise of doctors. And actually kind of coming back to all of our kind of lived embodied experiences and our expertise by experience of living in this world and knowing how it impacts our bodies. So that's kind of intro to me and my work, or whatever. And so I thought it would be nice to, since it's a session about health and health justice, to start the session with the Menti meter, about what does health mean to you, because obviously it means super different things to different people. So yeah, and I put like a space for you to do a few entries. So I might just play a little bit of music and see what comes up on the Menti. And how do I share my spot? I've got it. And then I'll share the word cloud as it comes up. Touch the mirror, rub the surface of the water, submerge yourself, all illusion shattered. Money's only paper, only hate. We'll destroy ourselves if we can't agree. How the world turns, who made the sun, owns the sea. World we know for piece by piece. Sat down up close to the colored black hole, like they'd always told me not to. Saw the one-dimension polka dot dance, and all the illusions shattered. Cool. Thanks everyone so much for sharing your kind of, what your thoughts are about kind of what does health mean to you. These are all really, really beautiful. Lots of connections between physical and mental health, which kind of increasingly through more and more research we know are not separate entities. And yeah, thinking about daily functioning in our daily lives, actually, like how do we get about during the day? Are we enabled to do that? Are we prevented from doing that? Wellness, I love whoever wrote peace. I think that's a really lovely one. And yeah, so something I think which is important to share before we go into discussion about health and climate is where kind of as a society we are, not necessarily people in this room, but as a general societal consensus about the definition of health as a result of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism, also known as kind of like capitalism on steroids, basically one of the key tenets of neoliberalism is individualism, and health has certainly not escaped that kind of infection by neoliberal ideology. So we're currently at a point in the discourse around health where the majority of the discourse centers on health as the absence of disease. So disease being, okay, it's to do with your, at the level of the individual. So it's like an organ dysfunction or a chemical dysfunction or something, but whatever it is, it's at the level of your body, and your body is like this machine of discrete different organs, and that organ functioning makes up your health. So it's at the level of the individual, and it's very disease focused. And it's the level of the individual, not only at the definition, but also what we believe impacts this. So it's at the level of the individual in the sense that it's your behaviors, which will, which will shape the majority of your health. So this is what neoliberalism tells you, that you need to exercise enough, that you need to eat healthy, none of which is necessarily untrue. But what it is the emphasis of whose responsibility your health and well-being is at the level of individual choices and individual behaviors. And the other thing that this definition of health teaches us is disconnection. And this also brings in kind of colonial destructions of connection with each other and connection with nature, is that neoliberalism teaches us that if health is an individual property, you can be healthy while your neighbor is starving. You can be healthy at the expense of other people. You can be healthy in a community which is suffering horrendous amounts of inequality, and that your health is completely dissociated from the health of your community, the health of our global community, and other people. But another really key part, which is a very important part of the climate and health discourse, is your health is dissociated from nature, from the rest of nature, from animals, from plants, from ecosystems, that those ecosystems and other beings are static objects to be exploited in order to fuel human well-being, which is kind of, as we'll come on to, a false kind of belief about where our well-being comes from. But there's a really, really key belief under kind of white supremacist ideology that the human body, and in particular some human bodies, are superior to nature and disconnected from nature. And the well-being of nature and the well-being of ecosystems is not something that is concerned with our own well-being. So that's kind of why I like to start with thinking about what health means to you and where we are when it comes to the definition of health. And if it's all right, because again, I think we'll come on to this, it can be quite an intimidating topic, but lots of these things are super intuitive, especially when we're looking at people, more and more people experience ecological disruption. So we're going to go on to the next mentee. Everyone. And the next mentee should say, what are some health consequences of the climate crisis? And yeah, it doesn't have to be in kind of fancy terms or anything. So kind of you could think about some examples of mental health consequences, like things which might cause people distress. You could think about the impact on the water we drink, the food we eat, the diseases we may or may not encounter in the world. So yeah, so I'll put on some more music. And yeah, it'd be great to hear what people think of this one. Yeah, these are looking really, really comprehensive and really great. Okay. It would be great to maybe, if people feel comfortable, talk through some of the answers, because I think lots of them are really, really great, and to think about like why you put the answer. Is there like anything that you read, experienced, heard about, which prompted you to put that answer? So kind of if you're not comfortable, but yeah, it's a small group, so I don't think we need to do like hands up or anything, but if anyone sees the answer on the screen is thinking, yeah, I could explain a little bit more about what I've heard about that or anything, that would be really great. But don't worry if you don't feel comfortable, but I'll leave that there and see if anybody wants to share anything. Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, so I put cancer as pollution. I put that not just because of lung cancer from fumes from CO2 and particles like that, but also because of PFAS chemicals, which has kind of become a pet research project of mine, because they're polluting a lot of waterways. They're now found in every human being, and they bioaccumulate, which has led to cancers, birth defects, all sorts of health issues. And lately, they've also done a study that say that they're obesogenic as well. So part of like why like you maybe can't achieve the health goals that you want is because it's beyond your control. If you've been exposed to too much of them, you simply, there's just no, yeah, something you do. Yeah, I don't remember the other ones I put. I'm gonna be honest. I have the memory of a hamster.
Yeah, no, that's okay, and that sounds like a really interesting project. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
I think one of the ones I put was eco-anxiety, and I think just for me personally, like with the overwhelming scale of this climate crisis which we are facing, it can just sometimes feel like a lot to process. And I guess that is kind of like the more like mental health side of it. And then in terms of like physical health, we put the like heat related illnesses like heat stroke. So we're seeing like increased frequency of heat waves here in the UK especially, which is quite scary. And I guess we're maybe not as well equipped as we should be for this, and we need to look at adaptations.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Megan, and appreciate your kind of personal struggles with it as well. It's really difficult. I don't know if Olivia or Elise, you want to share anything. I'll give you a minute to do so if you want, because I know Olivia is typing. But yeah, no pressure if you don't feel like it.
Yeah, I put anxiety, just like Megan. Eco-anxiety is quite a big thing when we think about health and the climate crisis. And the other one I put is food and water scarcity. I mean, it's quite straightforward. If we have crop failure because of climate change or drought, and we don't have enough water, that's directly going to impact how we can feed ourselves.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think we can also talk a little bit later about how for-profit governance of things like food and water exacerbates potential resource scarcity issues. And I'm now just reading what Olivia shared. And yeah, holding a lot of gratitude for you sharing that, Olivia, of how it impacts your health condition personally. yeah, that's really difficult. And yeah, difficult with the increased frequency of heat waves. So yeah, just holding space to thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and tough emotionally, and yeah. If so, before we move on to the next section, which I'll give you basically, I'll talk a little bit about health impacts, give you some resources. It's pretty actually fairly straightforward. And then talk about this framework, understanding the health and climate crisis, which hopefully will be useful to you. So can everyone see this? Okay, cool. So here are two really useful diagrams. One is from the CDC, one is from the World Health Organization, for understanding the health impacts of the climate crisis. And I won't talk through them all because they are all actually, fairly intuitive. And the details are kind of less important than why it's happening and who it impacts. So we've got things like injuries from severe weather. I saw that somebody put extreme weather events, which of course have the direct impact of what happens on the day or during the week or the weather event is happening, but also the long-term impact of things like trauma, displacement, impoverishment as a result of these incidents. We've got extreme heat, and we've also touched on supply impacts, impacting things like malnutrition, and also resulting in displacement, conflict, forced migration. But there's also a couple of other things which we didn't touch on, which are kind of maybe more medical. Things like air pollution, which is obviously one of the causes of the climate crisis, but is also worsened by increasing temperatures. Water quality impacts, so at higher temperatures and with less consistent rainfall patterns, you get increased spread of waterborne diseases. And same thing for vector-borne diseases, so things like malaria. So the range of where malaria carrying insects can travel changes as the patterns of heat change. And also have increasing allergens. And then this diagram from the World Health Organization is really, really useful for thinking about the different things here, which kind of at the bottom, some of the main climate-related health impacts which we just talked about, but for actually thinking how it ends up that those things impact people. So if we think about all the things which have to come together for a person to be really negatively impacted by a health outcome of climate change, you can see these three kind of main pathways, which the WHO talk about, which I think are really useful ways of thinking about it. So thinking about things which make people more vulnerable to health conditions, so socioeconomic inequality, demographic factors, existing health status, so coming from a disability justice lens as well. And then thinking about, okay, are people going to be exposed to this extreme weather, to the thing which might make them sick? And this is a question of, a lot of it is a question of adaptation and resource distribution of, this might happen, but are people going to be exposed? Is it going to have the devastating impact that it could? And then the third kind of pillar of this framework from the WHO is the ability of a health system to respond to health threats. So I find these three pillars quite useful. So thinking about who's impacted, how they're impacted, how bad that impact is, and what the capacity to deal with that impact is. But we'll come on to a little bit because I kind of touched on it there, onto health inequality and how it impacts with the climate crisis and a climate justice lens. And so this would be the last little thing I talk about before we go on to the questions and discussion. So a very good colleague of mine called Abhi Devanayagam, Dr. Abhi Devanayagam, who works for the Race and Health Collective, which I'd really recommend checking them out. In a piece we co-wrote recently, Abhi wrote that the health impacts of the climate crisis are not new wounds, but salt on existing wounds. And I think this is a really brilliant framework with which to approach thinking about the health impacts of the climate crisis, and also trying to avoid harmful, quote unquote, solutions as well. So at the center here, of this diagram, what we've got is a economy with the goal of the economy is to prioritize corporate profit and wealth accumulation over and above well-being and health. Those are not explicit aims of any of the way that our economies are designed. They are designed to facilitate wealth hoarding, continued resource apartheid, the continuation of colonialism through neoliberalism. And a key point of this is that extractivism is essential to a capitalist economy, which means that extractivism sounds like a fancy word, but it's not really. It means that you need to extract from nature and people in order to generate profit. And in order to do that, you obviously need to kind of create ideologies which justify the exploitation of people and planet. And a lot of that is where white supremacy, patriarchy, classism, ableism come in as part of the justification of exploitation and the continuation of huge injustices. So what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, and then it'd be great to hear if you found this useful, is talk a little bit about the journey, how extractive industries impact health. So we've talked about the health impacts of the climate crisis, but through the lens of salt on existing wounds, what we're going to do is go backwards through the journey of an extractive industry and think about how actually even before we get to the health impacts of the climate crisis, these are industries built on death and destruction. So if we take an extractive industry, so we could take the fossil fuel industry, a lot of this also applies for industries like mining as well. And so first we start with extraction. So the point at which that you are getting, say, oil out of the ground. And here we already see huge health impacts. So the Niger Delta, for example, where the vast majority of Shell's activity in Nigeria happens, has a life expectancy 10 years lower than the rest of Nigeria. And that's because of the pollution and the corporate and state-sponsored violence which those communities face as a result of being near to a natural resource which is being exploited. And here we see the kind of continuation of colonialism through resource extraction and the continued transfer of these natural resources to high-income countries in order to fuel consumption in those countries. And I'm sure you've covered like responsibility for emissions and responsibility for resource consumption by wealth bracket in previous lessons, so I won't go over that lots. But what we're looking at here is sites of resource extraction where people are working often in horrific conditions. The levels of pollution, as Michelle touched upon actually, like highly cancerous and other water pollution, food crop pollution, other ways in which the violent extraction of fossil fuels and other industries impacts people's health. And there is also here a very close link to state violence, militarization, and policing. And here I'm just going to kind of jump up a little bit. And a lot of what you have as a result of continued resource colonialism and the need for high-income countries, I put in quotation marks, to kind of grow their capitalist economies at this completely unsustainable rate, is you end up with resource wars, like the Iraq War, like many other wars and invasions, like the violence that's happening in the Congo at the moment, which results in displacement and border violence, all of which, of course, have a huge impact on health. And then you are met with incredibly like hostile borders at the same countries you've started these resource wars. For example, with the Rwanda deportations flight. So kind of we're going to continue kind of journeying through an extractive industry on this map and how it impacts health. But kind of hopefully what you can see is that what we're doing is we are kind of tracking how these industries have never ever been good for us. And in a way which we'll come on to later, which means that we can put incredibly powerful arguments together for health and climate justice. And then if we say take fossil fuels and we look at burning fossil fuels, we can see that at this stage of their use, they are also incredibly health damaging. So we're looking at, for example, the fact that the fossil fuel industry and the car industry have created a travel system which is entirely dependent on the private car. resulting in huge amounts of pollution and preventing lots of people from accessing kind of cheap, affordable public transport. But also within this comes the incredibly important lens of environmental racism, and how these polluting industries not only are like huge amounts located in the global south at sites of extraction, but also when it comes to where, say, in the US and the UK, fossil fuels are burnt, where those factories are, they are like, and where the big polluting tunnels are, like the planned Silvertown Tunnel in London, they are overwhelmingly in working class and or ethnic minority areas. And this is where you get kind of the campaign like Choked Up in the UK, pointing out, and again, this is even kind of before we've got to things like Temperature Rise, that these industries are killing people, and they are killing mostly marginalized people. And then I've got two more kind of intersections here. When we also think about fossil fuels, it's really important to think about what energy system we're using this for. Everyone's like, we need these fossil fuels to run our energy system, which is true, we're embedded in this, but also what kind of energy system do we have? At the moment, we have an energy system which is almost entirely governed by corporations for private profit. Which means there's a huge problem with actual meeting people's basic energy needs. We have we have very rich people and very rich corporations who are using up huge amounts of energy because it's profitable for them to be doing that. And we have the vast majority of people around the world who are living at much, much less than what they're entitled to a fair allocation of energy and resources, both globally and in places like the UK, thinking about the cost of living crisis and the ability to heat our homes. 2018, about 17,000 people died as a result of cold homes. So thinking about actually this system is not serving us at all. And finally, I wanted to point out a link between the fossil fuel industry with its learnings and collaboration with multiple other health harming industries. Things like deregulation, things like corporate advertising, things like corporate power are not kind of siloed, and these industries all work together to kind of achieve their aims of deregulation and ability to accumulate profit at the expense of people's health. So you will see a lot of the greenwashing tactics are kind of directly stolen from the playbook of tobacco companies, kind of getting doctors to endorse cigarettes, for example. And a lot of the advertising techniques are shared with the fast food industry. And there's an awful lot of learning and collaboration between these industries. So this is one way, well, this is part of the way that we think about salt in existing wounds. And the other way we can think about salt in existing wounds, not the other way, the highly interrelated way which we think about salt in existing wounds, is the fact that not only is a growth-focused, profit-oriented economy resulting in environmental destruction and its impacts on health, as we've just discussed, but the salt is on existing wounds from that society in other ways as well. So you have the wounds coming from the environmental degradation, but there are also many, many other ways in which an entirely profit-focused society is designed to and deliberately undermines health. So both relative and absolutes, and this is what we call the social determinants of health. And there's so many, and basically anything you can think of in your life, in your community's life, everything that is impacted by inequality, and that impacts your health. So it's really hard to like kind of explain this succinctly, but I've given some examples on these post-its. So for-profit housing economy results in poor quality housing. So you've got like damp, mold, lung diseases, etc. Lack of social housing and homelessness for huge numbers of people. You're looking at the psychological stress, which does become embodied. Like we know through more and more research that psychological stress becomes embodied through multiple pathways of trauma, of poverty, of racism. Those experiences become embodied, and exploitation and inequality results in both mental and physical illness, not just through their material impacts, but through the psychological impacts of living in a society which is very much trying to kill you. We're looking at things like workers' rights being eroded in order to facilitate more corporate profit. That results in things like increasing workplace accidents, lower wages, lack of proper workplace protection. A good example of that is PPE and sick pay in the UK. And of course, there's the issue of inequality and poverty, either relative or absolute, resulting in a lack of access to material essentials like food, like water. And of course, this is closely linked to the natural resources discussion, but the privatization of commodification of things and commodification of essential life goods, which are essentially like communal goods, like water, like food. The privatization of those not only results in environmental exploitation, but the denial of the basic foundations of life to a huge number of people. And then, of course, our health systems themselves are hugely impacted by this ideology. So what we have is this coming together of environmental and other ways in which an exploitative economy creates wounds. And the climate crisis is then another additional wound on top of that as a result of these systems. So we can never separate the health impacts of the climate crisis from the health impacts of an exploitative economy, from the health impacts of fossil fuel industry, because it is salt on those wounds and a result of the same system. So that's a health justice framework, which can potentially help you to explore and be confident talking on this issue. But I will stop there because I know that we're going to do questions and stuff. I have some stuff to talk about RE campaigning and co-benefits and other things, but I'll pause there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rhiannon. That was super interesting. And I particularly liked all the diagrams there to help illustrate. That was super useful. So yeah, we can do some Q&As. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. I'm happy to kick off. So one question I had was, how important do you think it is that the health services are prepared for the effects of climate change?
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. So obviously super important, right? Because we have locked in a huge number of impacts when it comes to the climate crisis, and adaptation to those is sometimes impossible, but sometimes doable. And I think also we need to take into the context that healthcare systems at the moment are not meeting current need for healthcare. But I think it's really important to look at healthcare need in context, right? So like a huge number of reasons why people are going to require healthcare is because of avoidable things which are causing harm, right? So like a huge number of people are accessing healthcare because of exploitation, because of various different factors where we are not stopping the harm, right? So like people coming to hospital, and more and more people are coming to hospital because we have not fundamentally stopped the root causes of harm. So that's a really, really important thing to think about while we discuss healthcare capacity. But at the same time, we know that demand for healthcare is likely to increase with the climate crisis, and becoming prepared for that is incredibly important. And of course, neoliberalism is undermining that with privatization, marketization, underfunding, poor workers' rights. And also, one of the intersections with climate justice, which is often not talked about, is what it would mean to incorporate climate justice into a healthcare system, given the fact that refugees and migrants are consistently denied healthcare. And for example, in the UK, doctors are forced to collaborate with the Home Office to report on undocumented people, and how as healthcare professionals, as citizens, as patients, that has to be unacceptable, especially in the context of the climate crisis, but also anyway. But more than kind of hospitals and healthcare, we need to think about how our idea of care itself is very neoliberal at the moment. So when we look at heat wave, people say, okay, stay at home, drink lots, it's your responsibility to stay well. You know, same with COVID, isolate, stay at home, all fine. But it ignores the structural conditions which prevent people from keeping safe in a pandemic or a heat wave. So we need to kind of expand our thinking about, okay, what is preparation, what is adaptation, beyond, okay, we need to get hospitals ready, but how do we move towards models of community health, models of community mutual aid, disaster mutual aid, where there are these systems in place to keep people safe, to keep people healthy, and to keep people well at the community level, so that we can be better taking care of each other day to day, and better prepared as well. So yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you so much. And I was also wondering, like, so what prompted you to get into climate activism?
That's a good question. I'm not sure really. I think I started in corporate health campaigning on access to medicine. So my kind of original background is in pharmaceutical companies and investigating pharmaceutical companies. And kind of through that job was like, oh, colonialism still exists. Capitalism is not great. And then I was like, oh, there's other problems this applies to, and then kind of spilled over into climate. But I think another really key thing here is when we talk about health, I'm always kind of embarrassed that we often jump to hospitals, and rather than like the question of, you know, and that is a function of what we've been told about health and well-being for decades. But the biggest question of all that we should be asking when we think about health is, how do we create, design, embody societies and economies which are designed to help people flourish, and which are designed to take care of each other and to take care of the ecosystems which we are in community with? Because that's the ultimate question, right? Of how do we keep well? How do we keep our communities well? How do we keep the ecosystems well? Is how do we design societies which not only aren't designed to destroy those things, but are designed to keep those things actively flourishing? So we can look at frameworks like degrowth, eco-socialism, indigenous philosophies, so many different ways of looking at the world, and thinking beyond, okay, well, we have capitalism, this is it now, and thinking, you know, go to the hospital if you're sick, and thinking, no, when I say health, I mean, and I absolutely mean, like a complete overhaul of our society to create a structure which enables people to be well. So yeah.
How do you think we go about that? How do we change this?
Excellent question. And I think, you know, with all of these things, it's emergent, right? There's no like, okay, we do this and then this happens. We don't have that guarantee. All we have is the ability to try and to learn and to keep growing and to build in movements, because realistic, powerful social, in my opinion, the only thing that's powerful enough to make and I've just got a thing saying my interconnection is unstable. Can you still hear me okay?
You cut off a little bit there. Would you mind just repeating that briefly?
Yes. Am I back now? Is it okay now? Okay, cool. No, I was just saying how with all of these things, it's emergent in the sense that, like, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen, right? Like, there's no guarantee that devoting your life to kind of justice campaigns things will get results, right? It's not like an input output thing, and that's okay, and we just have to sit with that uncertainty. And I don't know how to do it. I know that, like, I'm engaged in social movements and I have opinions on different effective strategies. I have opinions on how we take care of each other, and I'm always learning that. But I think the only how at the moment is to try and to learn and to do our best and to keep trying and to keep learning. Because the only thing which is going to create enough power to overcome what we're up against, really deeply powerful social movements, powerful justice focused social movements. And yeah, I think in terms of specific things, the health justice lens can be incredibly useful in campaigning. So for example, and I'll share some resources later, there's a campaign called for a Green New Deal, which I'm part of, which campaigns for a just Green New Deal in the UK. And what it does is uses some of the arguments I've just talked about, argue for radical policy change, saying, okay, look, this fossil fuel energy system is actually really not good for you anyway. Here are all the benefits which we could have if we switch to an equitable distributed renewable energy system. And really, like, tackling the narrative, acting on the climate crisis is a sacrifice. Because unless you're a fossil fuel company, unless you're a mega corporation, unless you're an incredibly wealthy person, tackling the climate crisis through wealth redistribution, moving towards an ecological, just, health-focused society is not a loss for you, right? There's a very, very small number of people who that is a loss for. And even then, it's not really a loss, because that privilege is, like, fake and relies on the exploitation of others. So what the health lens can do is, like, really hammer that point home and say, okay, look, actually, like, 17,000 people died 4 years ago because of cold homes. These are how many asthma attacks would be stopped if there wasn't damp housing, if we did a mass retrofit campaign. These are how many children who would be X amount healthier if we did a mass heat pumps installation. And those kind of things can be so useful. And there's so many ways in which that angle can be used, but I'd really recommend looking at the Health for a Green New Deal paper. It's like a report, and I'll kind of show you in a second that. And I think, what was the other thing I was going to say about the health lens? Yeah, I think that's one of the most powerful lenses which health can be used. And I think the other one is imagination, being like to people, okay, like, what would it mean for you to like feel healthy in your life? What would it mean for your community to be healthy? What are the things which you would need, demand for that to be the case? And what are the ways in which this world currently denies that to you? And really thinking, okay, you know, is it that ridiculous to demand a world in which I can breathe air which isn't contributing to the decline in my health? Is it that ridiculous to demand a world which prioritizes the well-being of my community over the fossil fuel plant which wants to set up shop here? No, you know, and really bringing that home to people, and help and like, yeah, facilitating people to own that. Yeah.
I think we've got a message from Olivia. On a personal level, what changes would you like to facilitate in your community to support those who are clinically more vulnerable to the effects of the current climate status?
I think that's a truly excellent question, Olivia. I think based on like some kind of initial research and thoughts that I've had, I have like some frameworks which are useful for thinking about this. But I would also potentially fire that question back and say that though the answers to that should 1000% be led by those with who are more clinically vulnerable to the effects of climate change. But a lot of the way that we can protect people and protect each other is nothing like super fancy. So for example, like we're looking at things like during heat waves, access to nature is a huge thing. If you have like tree-lined streets, if you have access to parks, you have access to waterways, your vulnerability to extreme heat is significantly reduced because you are not in like an urban heat island. So urban heat islands are places which often affect poor and marginalized people, where there is no lack of green space, like for example, like lots of tower blocks and lots of concrete, all structures which absorb heat and massively accentuate extreme heat. So thinking about how we can better design communities and how we can kind of facilitate access to nature. But I noticed that you asked on a personal level something about what changes would I like to facilitate in my community. I think mutual aid as an all-encompassing term is a brilliant way to think about lots of these things. So thinking about how we can set up community systems of support. So for example, I'm involved in a community farm and a community kitchen, who mostly provide food to people, say in a heat wave, who can't go outside, for example, to get food and things like that. But actually normally it's people who can't afford food. And things like how we expand those kinds of initiatives. Like one thing which would be really great to see, maybe in my local area, I can try and campaign for it, would be like cooling shelters, where places with air conditioning, so businesses, for example, like either are asked to or have to open their spaces for people whose houses are too hot or who can't be outside or who are homeless, where they can go and rest and get water and be in those cooling shelters. Because again, especially with the price of energy, not everyone can afford aircon and things like that. So those are kind of some of my initial musings on that question, but obviously not a complete answer. I think it will look different for different people. And I'd also be really interested to hear, Olivia, from your experiences, if there's anything which you kind of feel should be on that kind of in that discussion. Oh, thank you. But yeah, thanks for the question as well. That was really cool.
Amazing. So I think we've got time for like 1-2 more questions. So are there any books, like articles or resources that have particularly inspired you, Rhiannon?
Yes, many, and there are too many to name. Again, like I really can't emphasize enough that like all my knowledge is collective knowledge. But what I can do is I made a little thingamabob for you. I also forgot to mention reparations and how like health can be used as a really strong argument for reparations. But I would recommend reconsidering reparations. And yeah, just go and read that. And you don't need me to talk to you about reparations. These are some resources which I super highly recommend. which would kind of cover some of the things which I think are super key, and hopefully also like expand how you view kind of health and ecological justice and the intersections. So over here, we have the Urban Health Council's planetary dysregulation reports. They are really, really excellent. There's the first one, which is about planetary dysregulation health. So again, going beyond like emissions and thinking about things like pollution, environmental degradation, environmental racism. And then they've got these slightly smaller reports, and they're not just reading. Also, there some of them are interviews, some of them are videos on specific communities and how their health intersects with the climate crisis. So I would really recommend planetary dysregulation, transgender communities, and disabled. I would recommend all of these. They're great. Yeah, so it has this overall one about planetary dysregulation and health, and then it has these kind of sub-specializations. And these are all lived experience-based reports. They work, this is a research justice initiative, so they work a lot with people directly affected by these issues to create these reports, and that's who they're written by. So yeah, those are brilliant. This is the public health case for a Green New Deal, which I really, really recommend. I use it a lot. I use it maybe like once a month to like reference things if I want to make a point, or I'm like, oh, not quite sure what my talking points on food are. Let me go to this. So that's what I use. Inflamed: Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice is one of the best books I've ever read, and offers a slightly different way of approaching the intersection of health and ecological justice than I just did. Not in that it disagrees politically, but in the way that it's presented, which might, for example, what it does is it takes each organ system. So it would take the lungs, and it will talk about how the lungs are impacted by colonialism, by the colonization of medicine itself, and then it will take an ecosystem and talk about how it's related to lungs. So really, really excellent book. And then these other two are kind of like, I would say these three are the kind of biggest, my top three. And then, but these two are also really excellent, especially the racism and the environmental emergency report. I'm kind of assuming that you've had some kind of training in this on that, but which is why I didn't put it as the top three, but it's really good introduction to colonialism, racism, and the climate crisis. And this is an ecological justice manifesto. So again, thinking about reparations, partly written by a colleague of mine in the Niger Delta. So yeah, I don't know if like you want to take a screenshot. I'll just leave it there in case people want to take a screenshot. But these are all Googleable. Cool. And yeah, I'm just reading I'll stop sharing. I'm just also reading your response, Olivia, and reflecting on that. And yeah, thank you again for sharing. Yeah, peer support, companionship. Yeah, yeah, that's not an area that I have thought of before, so I really appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, that's really, really, really grateful for you sharing that. Thank you. Yeah, and I can always like email you, Megan, that screenshot in case people didn't get all the resources.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's any chance you could share those resources, so particularly fab, that would be amazing. I'm aware we're close to time now, so I think we're going to do some checkouts. I just want to say a huge thank you to Rhiannon. I really liked the interactive nature, because we haven't really had a mentee before on these sessions, so that was really nice. And yeah, in terms of checkout, so yeah, I'm feeling quite inspired and hopeful. So I'm really, really grateful. I'm going to pass to Michelle.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. It was interesting to hear what you thought of what community health looks like. Yeah, it just feels like it reinforces to me like we need to just connect as a community more and more. That seems to be like a central theme for lots of things, lots of socio-political justice things. Yeah, it's just really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elise?
Yeah, I think your presentation was really interesting. I've never thought that much about health in the context of the climate crisis, and that really opened my mind. I probably need to do more reading on it now, but thanks.
You, me both, at least. And Olivia, I know you might be typing, but yeah, thank you. And Rhiannon, any final thoughts?
No, just feeling like super grateful to have shared the space with you all. Sounds like a really exciting project that you've been working on. So yeah, really nice to meet you.
Amazing, thank you. And just a quick temperature check for next week. Would we want like a final closing session with Emma, or are people happy to kind of end it there? So like up here is like, whoa, yeah, would love one next week, or like middle, or then down low, happy to finish it here. Yeah, is that kind of a mid of the range, Michelle? Not too fast.
Oh no, that was meant to be enthusiastic. I just wasn't
Oh,
sure.
that's enthusiastic. Okay, it's just that Emma was asking, but yeah, amazing. And thank you for that, Olivia. Okay, so I will finish there, but thank you ever so much for coming, and thank you to Rhiannon again. And I hope you all have a great week. Oh, put something in the chat here. Oh, amazing.
Yeah, I was just sending because Olivia was thinking about exploring some things that they can do in their community, but it's also great for everyone to read. Just the direct link to the Dysregulation Disabled Communities report.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks guys. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.